We had been walking all morning, and were now well into the afternoon, trudging through the cold mud that was taking its toll on us. But nothing had caught our attention that we needed to be concerned about. Which was odd, seeing as Skyline and I had to defend ourselves nearly every time in the past from a few manticores roaming the side of Full Mountain. I haven't been particularly lucky this month. So where were they? "Let's break up here," Gale boredly remarked, pointing to a 2-story brick building that jutted out of the hills ahead. An old pharmacy building for a small town that's since rotted away. The gears in my head turned to remember that Sky and I had sometimes stopped in there to either prepare to fight or to rest after one with the local wildlife. Each idea depending on where we were headed. "Let's not stay too long," I called up to him, not wanting to have something or someone sneak up on us while we were vulnerable. "We're already late as it is. I don't want to take too much more time, even though I needed all the time I could get to search for the place for anything that I could use to barter with. If it came down to it, I'd give up everything but my pip-buck just to make this happen." As we walked up to the front of the decrepit storefront, the wind picked up sharply, and a familiar voice carried words into my ears. "Remember." I stopped, everything in my brain coming to a halt as my body went rigid. Slowly the gears in my mind strained, turning slowly to carry my memories back to me. It was something Pinky said, something in the last dream I'd had. How could I have forgotten it so quickly? "Backlash? Is everything alright?" Brass asked so softly I couldn't really hear him. He was probably speaking normally, but my brain hadn't paid any attention to him as it worked. It was a set of numbers. I was sure of it, but I can't remember what the numbers were. Why was it I can remember everything about Lowball's perfectly styled mane in Hoofington, but I can't remember something I was told yesterday? "Backlash." Gale put his hoof on my shoulder, breaking me out of my thoughts painfully. "What?" I screamed, glaring over at him as I startled him into jumping back against the brick facing of the building. I blinked, dumbfounded, as he was now sat underneath the address permanently written on the pharmacy, the tarnished brass lettering spelling out 5706, cracking the gears in my head over and dragging what Pinky told me to the forefront of my mind. This is it. I spoke slowly in disbelief, ignoring the others' murmurs as I trotted inside. "There's something here. Something we need," I called out, hoofing open the cabinets and drawers to the front counter that had long been scavenged by Sky and I. What could be here that Pinky knew I would need? I must have gone to this place 2 or 3 times since we found this place 8 years ago. "You two wait here," Brass called back to the others as he followed my incessant and frantic searching. "What are we looking for, Backlash?" "Pinky told me she would help us, and gave me the numbers 5706 to remember." I trotted out from behind the counter, turning to heading down the hallway towards the storeroom. As I opened the door, Brass slipped through ahead of me and stood in my way. "Backlash. Stop." His stern voice did little to deter my want to continue, but I stopped to hear what he had to say. He has so far proven to be better at decision-making skills than I've had, and it would be wise to at least hear him out. "I understand that you think she wants to help, but aren't you forgetting she was the one who set all this up? Yours, Sky's, and my names were all in that folder left there by her. You think she's just toying with us? Like she wants to see this happen?" I don't believe I want all this is just some sadistic game for her. But with everything I know about Pinky and 42, I can't actually put that off the table. "I'm just saying that she wanted you to go find something here, so why not let me look instead?" He shook his head and sighed. "Everything she's had you do has nearly gotten you killed. All I'm saying is, let me look this time." I rolled my eyes. "Look, I know what..." As I looked back at him, I glanced at the side of the empty vending machine against the wall across from me. 5706 was barely visible through the grime. "There! The numbers again!" I put my hoof over to it as Brass spun to look. "An old vending machine?" He remarked sarcastically as he got up with a chuckle. "I know you've been hungry, big guy, but this was the help she was going to give?" Brass has earned enough of my respect to poke fun at my weight, so don't get any ideas about it yourself. He stood in front of the empty vending machine, looking it over. I walked over and looked at it. It was the same as the last few times I'd seen it, and like usual, the only thing that looked intact was the selection pad, which was useless, seeing as Sky and I had just bucked the glass plate out when we raided it before. If you're sure this is it, maybe it has a hidden compartment? Brass tapped along the bottom side of the machine. I looked at the keypad as the gears in my head turned. I hoofed the numbers on it slowly. 5706, and then hit select. I was pleased to hear a soft hiss as the machine rumbled slowly, softly being drawn into the brick wall by some unseen mechanism. Once it slid far enough in, it slid sideways, stopping when it was flush with the gap it had left. I had always wondered why the front room and the back room were spaced so far apart. In front of us was a large steel door that looked a whole like the one under the family farmhouse. It's another vault. Brass gasped and jumped about giddily. The location alone is something that would make this worth a fortune. Even not knowing that was inside, he looked over the door in confusion for a moment. Actually, how do we get inside? I looked around the small recesses of the whole thing that it sat in, spotting a small hatch that nearly blended in with the wall. I hoofed at it, and finally hoofing it open. The inside of the hatch was painted yellow, and the 3 pink butterflies that denoted the Ministry of Peace were inlaid with another keypad. Well, I think we can take a guess at what's stored in here. I shrugged and looked at the keypad. I had seen one of these models before, something I never liked to work on. It had a deadlock system built in. If you didn't know the code, the doors would seal shut and reset a timer. Until that timer ended, the room was completely sealed shut. It's a good thing I have the code. I didn't really want to have to find a thermal lance to cut my way through. I hoofed the same 4-digit code in as before, sharply hoofing the return button and waiting. A series of whirls and clicks proceeded as the massive door swinging open. The lights clicked on, revealing shelves upon shelves of healing potions, both normal and extra strength. Clear boxes were nearly overflowing with RadSafe, Med-X, Radaway, lines and lines of bandages, crutches, splints, and jugs of surgical prep supplies. And set against the back wall were 2 pristine MK2 auto-dock units, still wrapped up in their plastic. Oh, Dr. Fitz would kiss me if he were here right now. I managed to spit out amongst my stupefied wonder. Brass trotted in, looking over boxes of miscellaneous medicines. Backlash, this is... Brass was cut off as the number pad next to me let out a loud pop, sparks shooting out of it as the door whirled to life again, swinging the massive steel plate quickly towards me. Brass's hesitation cost him, the door already more than halfway closed when he started to run. Brass! I screamed, shoving my hooves uselessly against the relentless push of the hydraulic mechanisms pushing back. The gears in my head spun sharply, making me throw my hooves before it shut completely, jamming my pip-buck between the frame and the heavy door. I'd seen pip-bucks take the full force of dozens of large-caliber rounds without getting a scratch, so I hoped the pressure of the door wasn't high enough to crush it. The gearing in the door whirled as it pressed down on my hoof, wrapping the pip-buck ever so tightly. Brass pushed at the door, grunting as he pushed his way through the small gap. If there was one time I was glad he was small as a colt, it would be now. I'm through! He gasped as he wound his way past my legs. I breathed a sigh of relief before feeling the pip-buck twist and press into my foreleg. I thought about losing other legs shot through my mind as I tried to pull it from the door, but the best I had done was manage to only let the door get a better grip. Backlash. Just pull your hoof out of it. Leave it behind. No! I screamed as the door groaned. The screen of the pip-buck cracked in thin lines as I strained to pull at my hardest. VFS display in my vision fuzzed as I felt the case splitting. It has the answers! And with that, my muddy hoof slipped free, sending me tumbling backwards as the doors whined, and loud crunch was all I heard as it slammed into the floorboards. Brass ran up and hugged me as I lay there, panting heavily. It was gone. All the audio logs, all the notes, Everything I had gave me the advantage over 42. If Pinky was doing something for a good laugh, I hoped she was having the time of her life right about now, because this was just cruel. Notepad and Gale galloped into the room, confusion and concern all too clear on their faces. "What happened?" Notepad asked, slowly walking over to the sealed door. The door to the room was going to close with me inside. Backlash used his pip-buck to keep it open. Brass's voice told me he was immensely grateful, but ashamed as well. If I wasn't so stupid, he wouldn't have had to sacrifice it. I pushed Brass off of me, getting back to my hooves. "Brass, you were right about the room. If you hadn't gone in, I would have." I shook my head and picked up Zin's hat off the floor, putting it back on. Notepad levitating something towards me in the corner of my vision. It was the top half of my pip-buck. The screen completely shattered as the whole thing had been folded over into itself. I took it in my hoof and put it in my saddlebags. "Thanks, but it's pointless now." I walked past every pony and back into the hallway. "Come on, no use in staying. We got what we came for." The light was fading on the horizon as we walked towards the bridge checkpoint to the pool, the bright lights of the 3 remaining towers shining as brightly as ever down to the streets below. 2 ponies were standing at the guard's post, both of them wearing leather jackets and gaudy, plastic-looking masks of Pinkie Pie's smiling face. A face which I was beginning to hate, even if she was my relative. "Hey!" one of them called out, trotting over as his buddy levitated his shotgun, battle-saddled to us. "No pony gets into the pool anymore without getting checked. 42's orders." The 4 of us stopped, my heart rate jumping as he approached, the gears in my head spinning into action. I lifted my left hoof, showing it to him. "We're not the guy she's looking for. You see a pip-buck on any of us?" "Yeah, I don't," he replied quickly, suspicion still rampant in his voice. "No pony who's looking for him was told to look for that till 42 got back yesterday." And that was me fucking it up again. "Great job, Backlash!" I walked up and peered under my hat, his eyes studying me through the mask. "So then, I ain't seen you before. How'd you know?" The gears in my mind shoved an idea into me that was crazy enough that it might just work. I hoofed my hoof into his collar and pulled him up to me, glaring at him as his eyes went wide in shock. "You know why Myron hired a hunter named Grinder? 'Cause I crush everything in my way looking for some pony." I growled at him, enjoying the way he squirmed in my grip. "The reason I know where the pip-buck is that I'm the one who dropped the sky car on the fucker and ripped it off his cold, dead leg." I nailed it. The guard pulled himself away from me, stumbling a few steps back before readjusting his jacket. Okay. I swear I didn't know you worked for the kid." He apologized as he stepped back out of the way. I grinned slyly and looked back at the others. Brass's face locked in a smirk that told me he was impressed. I nodded for the others to follow and walked over the bridge. The pool hadn't changed much since I had left, with the exception of that armed patrols of Pinkie's masked ponies were mixed in with the hustle and bustle of the nighttime shift change. That would make it easier to get past the guards. But with 42 here, who knows if I'll be able to make it in without her knowing. But best get right down to it then. As I continued forward, a shady-looking unicorn stallion trotted over from Red Lantern, catching my eye as someone who was curious about me. I stopped as he approached, trying to make sure it seemed casual and not draw attention to me. "Hey, you work for Myron?" I looked over his face as he spoke, his muzzle twitching in irritation as he mentioned the tiny drug lord's name. I studied his eyes as he waited for a response, noting that he was doing the same to me. "I have a feeling that if you thought I did, you wouldn't have asked." I kept my voice down, tilting Zin's hat down a bit to better hide my own eyes. "Whatever you want, make it quick." I glanced at his cutie mark, wondering exactly what 3 lightning bolts was supposed to signify. The odd stallion smiled, his blood-red eyes shining under the artificial light. "I need you to kill him for me." He took joy in merely asking me. "You see, he murdered Spare me the explanation. I'll do it. I cut him off. Just tell me where he is, and get the hell out of town. As much as I feel everybody deserves a second chance, there's a small list of exceptions. Namely, 42, Myron, and Sherbert. Evil like them shouldn't have a second chance. He's at the tanker. He responded quickly, sounding confused. Don't you even want to know? I was already trotting off down the street, Brass galloping to catch up with me after a minute. But I thought you said that every pony deserves a second chance, he asked, a bit of disappointment coming from his words. You weren't there, Brass. You don't know what he's like, what he's done. I brushed off his question and kept my hat down, slipping up alongside the tower that used to belong to the Stolator twins. It looks like they had been repurposed into 42's headquarters, as the bottom right quarter of it had been painted pink. Old MOM banners had been hung out outside the entrance, where 4 masked goons with light machine guns on battle saddles stood guard. Brass and the others followed silently as we entered Peppermint's bar, the tired-looking mare doing her best to look happy for all the ponies flooding the counter with thirsty muzzles. There were several other mares all dressed in pink serving drinks, while a couple of ponies sat on a few pushed-together tables in the corner, playing music for the crowd. If it weren't for the circumstances, I would have congratulated her on how popular she's grown. I pushed my way towards the bar, keeping an eye out for Myron. As I got to the counter, I tilted my hat up slightly when Peppermint swung her gaze over. A flash of surprise gazed her face before hope filled her eyes. Something was going so badly for her that I had started to look welcoming. This made me a bit nervous. She nodded for me to follow her, trotting out from behind the bar. I turned as Brass approached, putting my muzzle right next to his ear so he could hear me over the deafening crowd. When she tells us where the alcohol is, go tell Gale and meet me back here. I frowned as I felt bad for him having to be an errand boy for now. But if 42 did decide to show up at Peppermint's meeting, I could at least minimize the chances of him being there. Oh, and tell Notepad to go with him. I don't want him to be here with us. I nodded, and as he nodded and followed at my side. As we climbed the stairs to Peppermint's storeroom, I was stopped by one of the guards she had hired years ago. He put his enormous hoof out and shook his head. You know the rules. No gear inside. You can pick it up when you leave. I sighed and took Austin's disguise, also hesitantly handing over my saddlebags before being led into the back room. The guard opened up the old trunk and stuffed our things inside. My eyes beheld a surprising sight set into the lid. An off-white crate with the letters BEL stenciled in the back. He shut the trunk and looked over to Peppermint, waiting for her to nod before leaving. She was standing nervously in the center of her room, waiting until the door clicked shut before even appearing to relax at all. Peppermint, I need a favor. I tried to ask, as courteously as I could, watching as her eyes lit up. Whatever it is, I'll do it. She smiled, and nodded enthusiastically before her expression turned grim. That miniature psycho has it out for me. He wants to buy my stills off me, but I'm afraid that if I'll accept, he'll just kill me rather than pay. Which does sound like something he would do. I just need you to either deal with him, or get me out of here. And I need a cart of moonshine, loaded up and ready to go. Not to mention a contract with the town of Red Wing, stating that you will supply them with moonshine for 5 caps a gallon. I smirked, knowing that I was taking complete advantage of her situation, but I had played fair enough up until now. I risked everything for this, and I'm not going to take well enough for an answer. For a moment, she looked like she was about to explode on me. Her face turned crimson with rage. I looked at her expectantly, waiting for her to argue the point, allowing me to ask for an even more outrageous deal. She sighed as she conceded, walking over to her desk and grabbing a pen in her mouth. After a minute of writing, she picked up the paper and spit it out at me. Take that to my guys out back. They'll make sure you get rigged up. She sounded like she had just signed her life away, and I basically had. 5 caps was going to lose her money overall, which is making me regret what I'd just done. This is why I don't push customers. Not only because it does their business suffer, but so do they. I just wish I had some better option at this point. I looked down to Brass, who levitated the paper over to him, nodding to me before leaving the storeroom. "So, what about Myron?" she asked, a note of hopefulness in her voice. "Oh, some stallion in the street told me to murder him as well," I said with a shrug. "I told him I would. The wasteland is too full of evil as it is." I shook my head and sighed with the door open behind me, Brass coming in quietly. "Myron's drugs are the scourge on every pony. But with 42 behind him, there's no telling what lengths he'll go to in order to succeed." Peppermint just stared blankly at me, raising her hoof as I spoke. "And he's right behind me, isn't he?" She nodded, making me sigh. "I knew something was bound to go wrong." "You know, Backlash," Myron's voice was full of arrogance as ever, "I misjudged you. Here I thought you were a sensible business pony, maybe willing to join us and make a hoof full of caps." He continued as I turned around, looking into his pale eyes. "But now I see you're just another wasteland dipshit who doesn't know a goddess damned thing. I mean, look at me." He giggled giddily, while pushing the safety glasses he wore up to his muzzle. "I just finished manufacturing the first batch of PMTs, with our little illustrious Pink Queen at the head of my operation now. The whole of the wasteland will know the name of Myron." "No," Brass remarked as he turned the corner. His horn glowing as Myron spun around in surprise. Brass thrust a combat knife forward, the tip puncturing through the back of Myron's neck. "No, pony. We'll know who you were." Brass frowned and looked up at me. "He was the pony we were supposed to kill, right?" Myron gurgled and collapsed onto the floor, Brass's horn sparking and turning, the tip black, as his already weak magic finally gave out again. He panted lightly as I sat in shock. "He killed Myron." "Brass! What the hell did you do?" I screamed and flailed my hooves. You just stabbed him!" I trotted over and hoofed the knife from the dead drug lord's neck. It was a highly polished combat knife, almost to the point of being brand new, even though its blue handle wrapping was in remarkable condition. Well, aside from the yellow lightning bolt painted onto it. "Where in Celestia's name did you even get this, anyway?" "Lil Zeus gave it to me." Brass smiled and bounced on his hooves. "He gave it to me after you walked away from him." "Lil Zeus?" Peppermint nearly screamed out. "As in, Zeus Merdino Jr.? I watched as Brass shook his head to this. "I'm confused." I closed my eyes in frustration and tried to let the gears in my head spin. "I thought Myron killed the Merdinos." "He killed Mr. and Mrs. Merdino, but little Zeus wasn't on the train. He's been missing ever since the hit, although some ponies said they saw him with White Bishop's daughter. But since you killed him, she's gone missing as well." She walked up behind me and pushed at me with her hooves. I turned around and pushed her away, watching as she nervously looked around. "Oh, this is bad. Very bad. You need to go." I felt a sharp pain in my eyes, making me force them shut. The gears in my head spun to life and sent me warning signs over and over. Shit. If my eyes hurt, that means... I was about to respond when there was a loud zap from behind me, sounding like an electrical device just shorting out. I spun around, opening my eyes to see Brass, unconscious on the floor, 42 standing over him with a cattle prod in her smiling muzzle. The burns in my blood had warped the flesh on the right half of her muzzle and continued down all the way to her stomach. She let the rod go as the pink-masked unicorn levitated it towards me, pressing it to my neck. "You can't leave yet. The party's just starting." She cackled as the prod discharged, making me slump to the floor. "You'll have to stay to the very end. I promise you, it's gonna be a blast!" She stepped up and reared up, coming down on my face hard, sending me into the sweet bliss of darkness. I stirred awake on the cold metal floor, opening my eyes as I heard a large amount of talking ponies around me. An odd perspective had me perplexed, revolving as I sat on my hooves. The cage I'd been placed in was swinging in the night breeze, tilting and rocking, what looked to be 40 feet off the ground. I glanced around, trying not to focus on how much the swinging felt like I was on the boat again, finding that Brass was lying next to me unmoving. I prodded him with my hoof, relieved when he groaned. My neck hurt from where I had been shocked, but other than that we seemed fine. A whirling sound caught my attention as the cage started to descend somehow. An old carnival dunk machine came into view, most of it covered in a white sheet. 42 was standing on her hind legs next to it, holding a megaphone in her hooves, just watching as the crowd of ponies lining the streets parted for us so we could see. As the gears in my head spun up, the cage stopped with a jolt, setting down on the street with a clang. "Fillies and gentle colts," 42 called out. "We have a little show for you tonight." The crowd cheered at this, quieting down again as she waved her hoofs at them. "We have a special game set up for you, courtesy of a very talented—" She raised her hoof and pointed to the covered game. A unicorn on the other side used his levitation to throw off the sheet dramatically. "Miss Peppermint Schnapps." Peppermint was tied up and had been set on the dunk seat. She went as wide-eyed as I did when we noticed that the tank had been filled with taint. The rainbow liquid shimmered slightly as the crowd erupted into cheers and whistles. "Backlash! She's going to kill her!" Brass shouted as he looked over to me as I hoofed at the bars on the cage, powerless to stop her. "And we have a special guest here tonight, who will have the honor of playing our little game." 42 yelled enthusiastically. If she thought that Brass or I would play her game, she was sorely mistaken. "That's right, the one, only survivor of the Ponyville Massacre, committed by yours truly." Oh, goddesses, no. She can't! "Miss Pallet Jack." The tiny green Pegasus filly was levitated out, being kept in a cage barely big enough to fit her. But she must have been strong like her father, seeing as the cage had been bent out of shape, looking more like a sphere now than a box. She flapped her wings uselessly as she was levitated from it, being held high for all to see. "Now, Pallet, I know you don't like your Auntie 42 very much," she went on, her nefarious tone only making my blood boil. "But if you play my game and win, then I'll take you for some ice cream." She leaned down as Pallet was dropped before her. "Doesn't that sound good?" Pallet said something I couldn't quite hear, but it caused 42 to smile and look up to the crowd. "You hear that, my little ponies? She just wants to go home to Daddy." A collective awe came from the crowd, their tone denoting that they thought it was adorable. 42 nodded and raised her hoof again, leaning back down to the filly. "I'm sorry, but I killed your daddy. He's not there for you anymore." Pallet spun around and bucked 42 square in the muzzle, not even visibly causing her to flinch. I guess after you've had your muzzle burned as badly as she did, you'd probably lose feeling in it. 42 reached her hoof back and hit Pallet hard, sending the young filly into the ground. "Let the games begin!" she shouted, getting the crowd to explode into cheering again as she nodded to the unicorn who had revealed the tank. He levitated a bucket of balls next to Pallet as 42 looked at her. "Remember, no ice cream until you can win the game." Pallet nodded softly and hoofed the ball out of the bucket, and looked at it. She swung it around, throwing it towards the bright red and white ringed target. The crowd silenced as the ball traveled all of 3 feet before dropping to the ground. 42 faced hoof at this, before looking back up with a smile. "Aw, she's just tired. Let's give it up for the filly, folks," she shouted, making the crowd stomp their hooves. Pallet cried out as she was levitated forcefully back into the cage. She was then carried off out of sight again. "She certainly gets an A for effort. But I need some pony who can really throw." She raised her hoof as her eyes looked around the crowd. "Do we have any volunteers?" She smiled and set the megaphone down as she wound up. Ponies cried out even more energetically, rushing to form a line for a try. She made her way over to our cage, nodding to random ponies as they called out a compliment to her. She sat down and counted her head, shaking it as her expression beamed exuberance. My ears picked up the sound of the ponies in the line starting to throw, so I figured I'd start the conversation. You realize that I'll never tell you anything, right? I smiled as a twinge of irritation popped into her eyes. She whistled, holding her hoof out before some pony ran over and deposited an old 10mm pistol into her hoof. She pointed it at Brass, watching for a reaction from me. One that I didn't give. Wow, you're just as bad as the goddesses at this. You know that? I smirked and shrugged. Nothing in this hellish wasteland can make me tell you where that facility's at. Her eyes lit up for a moment, a snickering escaping her muzzle. Wait, do you think I was looking for the lab? Her giggles quickly evolved into uncontrollable laughter, making her gasp and drop down onto her back as she tried to contain herself. I'm not looking for that silly, she shouted in between her gasps. I looked over to Brass, who was just as confused as I was. Oh, I'm going to miss this when we're done, she remarked in what was so far the only truthful thing to come out of her muzzle tonight. My ear registered another miss on the dunk tank. Thank Celestia, none of those ponies could throw well. You do know that the lab inside a full mountain, right? I mean, I know where I came from. It's not something you forget. I was locked up in Orchard 7 for years before they sent me into that Manhattan tank. She shook her head, dismissing the negativity that was in her words. The pool contains all magically charged flux for the machine. You had to have at least figured the machine was inside the mountain when I took this place over, she said as she smiled brightly. I blinked and scrunched up my muzzle as the gears of my head put everything together, only being pulled out from my thoughts as 42 fell to the ground again in more giggle fits. You didn't know? That's just too good. Her annoying taunting and flaunting was doing nothing to quell the growling rage inside of me. I slammed my hooves against the bars in anger, making her quiet down quickly. Then what the hell do you want from me? I barked out, wishing for nothing more than to just get my hooves around her neck. Why keep me locked up like this? Not like I was ever going to consider it, but screw what Bit had said. Ponies like her didn't get a second chance. Another whack preceded the disappointed moans of the crowd. 42 sat back and pressed herself to the bars, her sadistic grin as wide as ever. I want you to tell me where to find the pond. Her words oozed with the pleasure she pulled from my hatred. I swung my hoof forward, slamming it into the bars again, not even making her flinch. Never, I growled out. She ignored my answer and continued. Once I have the pond, I'm going to force you to watch as I tear down everything you've ever liked. I'll murder every pony in 10 Pony Tower. Make sure to save that DJ a seat right next to you for it. Next, I'll focus on riddling the wasteland of those troublesome steel rangers. 42 put a hoof to her chin as she looked into the sky and thought. Maybe I'll start with your little monster friend. She smiled as she glanced down at Brass. Go ahead, he screamed at her, breaking me from my growing rage. I turned and grabbed him, pulling him close and covering his muzzle with my fetlock. That didn't make him too happy, but I couldn't afford pissing off 42 enough to actually kill him. There was another thump as the softball missed his target. How much longer could she go on doing this? Maybe I'll start with your pretty, blue mare friend. 42's oily voice made me shiver. I smirked as I thought of something I could use. You won't even get the chance, 42. Come a week from now, there won't be a wasteland for you to control, I said proudly, thinking about how I may be stuck in here, but at least my words didn't have to be. You see, Steel Ranger Elder Strawberry Sherbert has the location of every mega spell still hidden inside Equestria. 42 met my smirk with one of her own, softening her voice as she leaned in close. What do I care? I'll have an unending army that mega spells won't stop. I can just overthrow her rule and retake Equestria. She chuckled to herself as another pony missed the mark on the dunk game. You just don't get it, do you? I leaned up to the bars. She doesn't want to rule the wasteland. She wants to wipe it clean. I smiled as my words erased 42's smug look. You, me, she doesn't care about us. She's content with the Steel Rangers retreating back underground for another century while we rot away to nothing in balefire and radiation. I sat back and shrugged. Your army may be unending, but how long will they last against starvation and radiation poisoning? Ding! The ringing of a solid ball hit on the dunk game was punctuated by a mix of cheering and disappointed ahs from the line. I looked up just in time to see Peppermint drop below the surface. I growled and slammed my hooves against the bars as 42 smirked, not even bothering to look back. After a few moments, Peppermint resurfaced, coughing and gasping, hanging half of herself out the tank as she tried to catch her breath. But that wasn't right. 42 didn't strike me as a non-lethal prankster. She looks to have only filled the tank with taint-colored water, leaving Peppermint unharmed. The gears in my head spun to work again, trying to figure out exactly what 42's reasoning was. I looked at 42's muzzle, mouthing words silently as she kept her gaze locked onto me. 3, 2... I shut my eyes and curled myself around Brass, feeling the pressure of the explosives in the tank slam into me. I could feel splinters of wood jab into my coat, cutting jagged lines across my side. The ringing that filled my ears faded slightly after a few seconds, letting me hear the screams of agony and pains of other ponies around me. I got back to my hooves, turned, and looked over to 42. She had several large chunks of wood jutting out of her body. One had completely torn into her right foreleg, and was still lodged through both sides of it. She let out a deeply psychotic laugh as she pulled herself off the bars, wincing from the pain. I glanced around the smoky street. The bodies of at least half a dozen ponies lay scattered, or in chunks. If what you say is true, I suppose Tanpony will have to wait. 42 choked out as she looked over to her unicorn friend as he returned, nodding as he levitated a healing potion over to her. I'll look into it, but I'm only doing it because you're family. Backlash. I was knocked from my hoofing as the cage began to rise up again, stranding us into the air once more, and leaving me to contemplate whether or not I should be blaming myself for Peppermint's death. So, what do we do now? Brass asked slowly. The spark of hope he normally had gone from his voice. I don't know, Brass. I sighed and flopped down. I don't know. Level up. +9 speech, +6 barter. New perk. Fission mailed. Not even a good disguise can help you sneak, so you instead shift your focus on striking first whenever you inevitably get caught. You now gain an additional 2 points towards your combat initiative.